Thank you so much, Dr. Conway Turner, for that overview of SEL research. Good morning, good afternoon for some of you, depending on the time zone that you're in. My name is Rose Jackson Buckley. I am the Assistant Director of Technical Assistance at the Midwest and Plains Equity Assistance Center. Our Assistance Center supports a region of 13 states. And previously, before my role in a life a while ago, I am a former special education teacher. And as well, my PhD is in school psychology, and I've been a practicing school psychologist, as well as a researcher in several different technical assistance types of environments. So today, my focus is around specific classroom practices that really come out of the research. And as Dr. Conway Turner discussed, CASEL has 5 competencies that we use as an essential guide when we think about social emotional learning in our classrooms. So we believe that CASEL's work is a wonderful framework and starting place as we think about these individual competencies. If we could go to the next slide, I just want to point out that as we think about equity and centering equity, we know that individual development isn't something that's demonstrated in isolation. So one of the things that we did at our center is just tried to reframe or think about, in addition to the competencies that CASEL includes, are to think about ways that we can really center equity. So we took a second look at these competencies and, this understanding that we don't operate in a bubble and that our social cultural framework really supports the influences of the development of these skills. So our social interactions, our personal identities, our histories are all influenced. And so how we feel, what we think, and how we behave are different depending on the various contexts and the histories of these experiences. So we took these competencies a step further. So let's talk about the first one, self-awareness. Here, CASEL's definition is very important, but we want to take this a step further as we think about how our students might recognize their feelings in our classrooms. What is it about their identities, their personal histories, maybe community practices, or other contextual components that impact those feelings, thoughts, and behaviors of our students? Sometimes I might ask myself or other practitioners, do we understand this for ourselves as adults? And how do we really promote this understanding with youth when we ask them to reflect on these things? As practitioners, do we even understand how our own identities, privileges, certain experiences influence how we perceive education, how we perceive our students and their families and caregivers, and how we come to understand learning and development of our social emotional skills? The second one, self-management. This competency is really important, and it suggests that our students should handle stress by controlling their emotions. However, I just want to add that instead of controlling emotions, we want to think about how can we really honor our students' emotions? What is it that we can do in our classroom to really support students in feeling liberated to express their emotions and opinions in a way that's constructive and healthy? It's important to think about how educators, how we, including myself and educators, how do we create those safe spaces for our students to feel comfortable and empowered to practice these skills and express themselves, when they make decisions towards self-determination. The third component of self-awareness, CASEL states that we want to have healthy relationships with diverse groups. This again is really important, but we have to be careful. We want to move beyond just the recognition of diversity and maybe distancing ourselves from diversity and that we're appreciating it. But how do we really personalize this? How do we show our appreciation for differences in the spaces that we create? How are we incorporating the value of the lived experiences of our students and the multiple perspectives of others? It's one thing to be aware of difference and acknowledge that, but it means something else to really appreciate that and incorporate that into our classroom or school practices and utilize that in our learning and learning through those experiences. The fourth one of relationship building. This competency is really important to take a step further and ask ourselves, how do we establish empowering relationships with our students and our families and caregivers and community members? How do we really support that with our students and honor those assets and funds of knowledge and incorporate that into our classroom? And for the fifth one, responsive decision making. How do we allow for meaningful decision making and opportunities for students to give feedback? And really creating that space, we're providing a space for our students to also critique social norms and the status quo and think about ways that they can better benefit communities and society. So moving to the next slide. One thing I've done is really kind of combined these ideas into 5 major components, and I have resources for those components that I would like to share in the chat box that really further describe potential classroom practices. So the first one is thinking about, as a classroom practice, creating that safe space. Sometimes when we think about trauma-informed care, we can focus on individuals and neglect group experiences of trauma, or thinking about inequitable systems that might address root causes of trauma. So if we really kind of reframe this and think about how are we creating healing safe spaces is a great way to really practice that trauma-informed care with an equity lens. So you'll find in your chat box, it's really a self-assessment that you could use for the spaces that you've created, and thinking about ways that we can really build safe and inclusive schools or classrooms. So oftentimes we might think about, when we create safe spaces, the physical safety, but are we also creating conditions for intellectual, cultural, and social emotional safety and inclusiveness in our spaces? It is this environment where we're really creating the conditions for our students to utilize their skills and practice their skills. Sometimes I do hear from educators, I just don't have time. It's one more thing that I have to do. But if students aren't getting a chance to practice those skills in a safe space, we're not necessarily sure where they're providing a better place for them to practice those skills. So to better prepare them for when they walk out of our doors and face the challenges of the world, we want to think about these 4 pillars of the emotional safety, cognitive safety, and as well as intellectual and cultural safety. The next slide. When we think about classroom practices, we also are thinking about developing critical consciousness. I'm going to provide a resource in the chat box that's really helpful in thinking about how we might support the development of critical consciousness. So here, when we think about critical consciousness, we also want to think about aspects of implicit bias, and as well as things like power and privilege and how that might really impact the development of social emotional skills. So for example, I had a teacher once say that, implicit bias was really important to consider in developing social emotional skills, which I completely agree. But if we think about then power, and not all implicit bias is created equal, and we also want to think about how aspects of power might influence that bias. So if we think about, for example, perspectives on standards of beauty, and we're supporting students in developing healthy identities, talking about what those standards, the aspects of privilege and power that might surround those aspects of beauty and self-acceptance, and developing a positive self-identity might be impacted here, for example. So quickly, if we go to the next slide, I'll share also the resource here. So thinking about developing our safe spaces means that we also engage in culturally responsive practices. I provided a resource in thinking about that. So we want to think about promoting social justice through critiques of discourse, really thinking about centering and honoring cultural assets and achievements of our students. We want to think about fostering linguistic, literate, and cultural pluralism in our classroom by sustaining in-group and cross-group cultural practices. And then if we want to go to the next slide, another classroom practice to consider is developing communal practices. When we think about developing communal practices, we want to think about, in our dominant culture in the United States, much of what we do emphasizes individualism. But what are ways that we can really honor a collective space where we can co-construct meaning, co-construct knowledge, resolve conflict within our students by maybe doing circles or daily check-ins? How do we really communicate to our students that their voice is important and the knowledge that they bring into our classroom is important, as well as promoting social responsibility for our students. And finally, the next slide, when we think about effective classroom practices, we also want to think about community engagement. Are we developing partnerships with community organizations? And are we inviting community members into our space, as well as, engaging in community practices and promoting students to really understand their influence in society, and providing those opportunities for students to demonstrate altruism and supportive behaviors? I will add those resources to the chat box as well. And if you're interested in additional resources around those practices, that's something definitely I can provide. I think next we will be hearing from Elise around Head Start and SEL and equity.